Hello, gardeners, and welcome to Gabbing About Gardening. Today we are gabbing with Jason Croutch. I call Jason my rose guru. Jason is the owner-operator of Fraser Valley Rose Farm. He is a horticulturist and refers to himself as a Rosarian advocate. Welcome to Gabbing About Gardening, Jason. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Let's start with you explaining what a Rosarian advocate is and why you call yourself that. I've never heard that term before.
This might be the first time I've heard it too. So I don't know that that's really my calling, but what I do try to do is speak for the rose in the garden and its history, and for those people who are part of the hobby, and try to put their concerns forward, particularly towards the preservation of old garden roses. Roses have been around for a couple of thousand years, and I'm going to say that many of the older roses, the ones that aren't currently in the trade, are being pushed out by other garden plants, and the hobby itself is in a bit of trouble as far as preserving those old roses. So I'm happy to work with people who are collecting those roses, distributing them either by selling or giving them away. So that's kind of my personal mission as far as roses go, is to keep some of the older, out of the trade roses more available for the hobby.
I love it. What a fabulous calling. You're the rose whisperer of BC and possibly Canada. And you ship your roses all around Canada, don't you?
We do. When I have them in the smaller sizes, they ship fairly well. They don't ship real well in a big pot, so that takes away the summer shipping. But in spring and in fall now, we take the smaller roses in the little pots and we ship them all across Canada. It's always a bit of a roll of the dice how they're going to take the trip from BC all the way to Quebec or Newfoundland. But it's my pleasure to get these into the hands of people across Canada if they take a little bit of a beating along the way. My customers have been very understanding of that, and we work together to make it work.
Well, people love what you are doing. I watch a lot of your YouTube videos. They are some of the best on not only roses, but really any topic. So thank you for that. Now, today we are going to focus a little bit, at least, on how to treat your roses during this season. Today is June 8th. I'm calling it January, where I am on Cortes Island. You're down in the Fraser Valley, British Columbia. I think we're having quite different weather. And you're going to give us some tips on how to keep our roses blooming. Can you launch into that advice? And I know so many people are looking forward to hearing what the Rose Guru has to say about that.
Well, sure. So this time of year, we're going into that part of the year in my area, and probably pretty uniformly across Canada, where we're starting to see the first flush of blooms out of our roses. Most typically, it's going to be late May in some climates, but more into June is when you're going to see the first flush of blooms. And people talk about the pruning of roses quite often as that first pruning you do in the season, oftentimes in February or March, when your roses are just about to come out of dormancy. You do a bit of pruning for shape, and you try to get them back into the shape that you'd like for your garden. But what is overlooked a little bit is that the importance of pruning throughout the season, particularly as we come into this first flush of flowers, is that if you deadhead your roses, you can get more blooms out of them. And let me back up a second here and say that if you're growing something like a rhododendron, if you pruned it once a year for shape, it's no big deal. You're not going to get any more blooms after that first flush anyway. But with roses, because they are repeat bloomers and such high performers in the garden, you can tweak it a little bit. You can play with your roses to get a little more performance out of them. So this first flush, generally in this January time, they come into their first flush all together. Almost all the roses come at once. And then you'll see that after the bud stage and the bloom stage, uh, the first of those roses will start to fade. The petals will start to drop, will start to look a little blousy, a little less well formed. And at that point, it's the time when the rose itself is thinking, okay, I've done this flowering, I've been pollinated. It's time for me to set my energy towards developing fruit. So if you look closely at where it dropped the petals, right behind where the petals were held, you'll see that that where the rose was is starting to swell. I think they call it the receptacle. And what it's trying to form is the berry of the rose, or the fruit of the rose, called a hip. And if you let it do that, that's fine. Later in the season, people love to have their rose hip jelly or use it for many other purposes, wildlife and everything else. But if you let it do that, that's what it will devote its energy towards, is to having those hips ripen and to put that energy towards seeds. So if the simplest version of deadheading, and I know that sounds like a morbid term or something, unless you're thinking about musical subculture, it could be a Grateful Dead reference. But if you're deadheading, the simplest version of that is that you just reach towards where you see that receptacle, you grasp it firmly in your hand, and with a quick twist of your wrist, you just pull off the head of the rose. And that's the simplest version. And that's what I do about 50% of the time out there. Is I just go out there and I snap off some roses that are spent. And what it does is, again, it starts to redirect that energy of the rose back into the existing blooms and back into new growth for new blooms.
Let me ask you a question here.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
First of all, I can totally relate to the swelling hips. I understand how that happens. But of course, you're not talking about exactly those kind of hips. But I just want to ask: do all varieties of roses take kindly to this deadheading treatment that you're recommending after the first flush of blooms, or are there some that you actually are better not to deadhead?
I don't think it's ever going to do that much harm. There's some roses that get less benefit from it because they're once blooming roses. So some of the species roses, some of the older garden roses that I advocate in the garden, they only bloom once in the year. So whether you deadhead them or not, they're not going to bloom again. But it generally will do no harm. The only harm that you could possibly see out of it on those varieties is that you just won't see the hips later on, but it will redirect the energy again, at least into the growth of the shrub. So there's no harm in doing it, except that you'll miss those hips. But
are you saying that if you want to leave them on as almost an ornamental feature later in the fall, it's not going to hurt the plant, or will the plant be healthier if you take them off? Should we be sacrificing our hips for the overall health of the whole body of the rose, or can we leave some for?
Well, I think there's some value in holding on to hips for wildlife. I think there's some value in the ornamental value, particularly some species. Rosa rubrifolia is one that I'll point out that has insignificant flowers. They're really not much, but beautiful, beautiful hips later on in the season. So for that one, I would make an exception. And here, the general rules I'm talking about are for the majority of the reblooming roses that we're talking about that will be in most Canadians' gardens, is that the deadheading will improve their condition. For those who are collectors like me, you probably put a little bit more thought into what you want to get out of your rose, whether you'd like to sacrifice the hips for more vigorous growth, or whether you'd rather see those hips on there, and that's fine too. Either one is a good choice. On the once bloomers, for the repeat bloomers, I would strongly recommend, if you want to get the best out of your rose, to do the deadheading at least on the first flush of flowers, maybe even the second and the third. And then usually I knock off sometime around August, September, because I want to see some of those hips at the end of the season as well. And I want to leave some on for the wildlife over the winter. Particularly, there's a group of roses called the Rugosa Roses that are strong performers, and their hips are just so large and beautiful, bright orange in the fall, and make wonderful jams and jellies, or additions to other jams and jellies. So yeah, those ones I would definitely go out of my way to let some rose hips develop on those.
Yeah, I love the rugosas. They're so easy to grow. And I really should make a disclaimer here. I do grow a couple of roses. I grow some climbers and ramblers and some rugosas. And Jason, I don't even know the names of my roses. And yet I love them. They're all fragrant. They're all beautiful. They're all healthy and vigorous. Does that make me a bad rose grower?
No, well, I would say you're not alone. You're not alone. Most people who grow roses, they've either moved into a place that have the roses or they've lost the tags. And it's probably the most frequent question I get is, can you identify this particular rose for me? People send me pictures. The problem is, because many thousands of roses have been introduced over human history, it's going to be pretty hard for me to narrow it down. But no, for the most part, it isn't going to make any difference to how you enjoy the hobby, which is what matters, whether you know the name of that rose or not. It would make a difference for me as a collector, for me as somebody who's trying to sell these or gift these to other people. It's kind of nice to put a name to the face, but for the average gardener, no, it's not an important thing, because most of them can be treated very much the same.
I feel so much better about myself. Thank you. Because, I know all these people who, well, and I watch it on your Facebook, Fraser Valley Roses page, and the interaction. You've got some real knowledgeable rose people there. So good. I'm glad. I'm not knowledgeable, but I am a rose lover. So continue on and tell us what more we want to do for our roses for continued blooms.
So I will say, returning to the deadheading thing, that after you've nipped those off with your hands, which is the simplest version, there does come a point when more roses are out of bloom than the ones that are in bloom. And at that point, it is probably the time to pull out your pruners and just your hand nippers and go back to that rose. And for this step, you want to take off all the remaining stubs and heads and even aim to take a little bit of the size and structure out of the rose. So it gives you a second chance to reshape your rose throughout the season, because during the season, some stems can grow much larger or out to a certain direction, out into the garden path or wherever you don't want it to be. And so this is a good chance to correct that, to get rid of some of the dead and damaged growth within the rose, and to clean out the center of the rose a little bit. And by clean out the center, I mean roses like good air circulation and flow within the roses, within the foliage. And so if you aim to get rid of some of the growth that grows into the center of the rose, you can eliminate that, and it'll probably pay off in having just a generally healthier rose and better shaped rose. So that's the whole process of deadheading. It's not hard. As an individual step, it's very, very easy. But people do freak out a little bit about the question of, how should I prune my roses? It seems so intimidating. The answer is you prune it once in the spring, usually for shape. You do a little bit of maintenance deadheading throughout the season. And if you miss one of those steps, no big deal. It isn't gonna hurt anything. The worst you're gonna get is a rose that's a little taller than you want, or a little less, or produces a few less flowers. If you go away on vacation, it isn't gonna harm things.
Beautiful. Well, I feel empowered, Jason. Now, what about feeding roses during this late spring and upcoming summer season?
Sure. And I continue feeding my roses. Again, I talk about August or September. I mean, my climate, your climate as well, relatively mild. People will have to make their own judgment call across Canada about when you stop feeding your rose, when you stop pruning your rose. But I usually do it in August. And when I talk about feeding it, I give them at the time of their first pruning in the spring, I give them a cup of alfalfa meal or cubes, just to improve the soil and get some food into them. I usually repeat that treatment every month or two through the spring. I might give them a total of 3 or 4 treatments of a cup of alfalfa. And that just helps, again, to feed the soil. Between that, there's other organic amendments you can add. And by organic, I'm not talking about the certified organic production systems. I'm just talking about things that came from living sources. So things like kelp meal, bat guano, wood ash, those things, which will boost the potassium and phosphorus. So the alfalfa serves as a good general purpose bulk fertilizer. The equivalent, if you were looking at NPK, and most gardeners watch that type stuff, would be like a 2-1-2. So it's a fairly low feed, but relatively balanced. And then from there, you can add the potassium and phosphorus with the other sources that I recommended. And like I say, a few good feedings early in the season, and then I knock off. Sometime around August, I stop the feeding, and I also stop pruning and just let the roses do what they naturally will do to come to the close of their season. So they'll put on hips, they'll harden off their foliage if they have any common sense at all, and they'll get ready for the Canadian winter.
Like the rest of us. I wish I would stop feeding myself at the end of summer. Unfortunately, it goes in the opposite direction most of the time. Okay, now we hear a lot of, I don't know if this is myth or lore or rural legend or rose legend, but planting nails in the soil, banana peels, coffee grounds, are any of those things useful? And do you recommend any of them?
Yeah, you hit on a few of them. I hear eggshells a lot. So let me go through some of them that are like the big pushes, the ones that you hear a ton about. You say coffee grounds. Yeah, coffee grounds are fine. There's nothing magic about them. They are fairly, just like I mentioned, the alfalfa is. The coffee grounds are a good, relatively balanced source of nutrients for your plants. I personally would, because I don't produce enough coffee grounds to feed all of my roses in small amount. I would just put it into the compost pile is what I would do. And then it will eventually find its way in with the roses. So it's a good organic source, but I don't go out of my way for the coffee grounds. Eggshells do next to nothing. Eggshells don't break down in the soil. I've seen Robert Pavlis is a Canadian gardener who does a lot of garden myth busting. And he did a good expose or a good video series on watching how his eggshells didn't break down in the soil. So they're not very useful that way. And if you need to add calcium sources, there are better ways to do that. I hear Epsom salts. Now, Epsom salts is a simple fertilizer salt that includes magnesium and sulfur. And rose people and tomato people particularly go nuts for Epsom salts, and they add it routinely to the base of their roses and tomatoes. The problem with that is you're adding a simple fertilizer that you don't know that your plant needs unless you've done a soil test. I don't soil test for everything, but my general bias would be to give your roses a balanced diet. I think most dietitians amongst humans would say, give yourself a balanced diet. That's what you would do with your plants as well. If your plant doesn't actually need more magnesium, then you're not doing any good by giving them Epsom salts. In fact, you can be doing some harm by locking out some of the other fertilizers that the rose could take up or could occupy those sites in the soil. So Epsom salts I don't recommend unless you have good reason to think that your roses are short of magnesium. I see lots of fun where there's banana peels. Banana peels, once you dehydrate them, add so little to the soil. Unfortunately, people impart upon these solutions, the coffee grounds, the banana peels, the eggshells, they say other things about them too. So they don't say it's just a fertilizer, just a general organic fertilizer. They say it's going to reduce your pest problems. It's going to cure your slugs. It's going to, give you more basal breaks or shoots. And none of those things have good scientific evidence. So I would say for most of those organic things, throw them in your compost and apply your compost as you would a manure, as you would that alfalfa. Any good organic amendment is going to help your roses, but there's nothing particularly special about these other ones. And in the case of Epsom salts, it can be harmful. One more I've heard, sorry, I got to launch into one more, is people, I've seen the YouTube videos, and I'm a YouTube guy, so it's always tempting to get on there and talk about these things, get millions of views. People will bury a can of sardines or bury a fish head underneath their plants. Where I am, that would be more likely to be targeted by skunks or raccoons and cause an awful mess in your garden. And again, it's just another organic source. So there's nothing special about those organic sources of fertilizer that will improve your roses or other plants. And in the case of rotting fish carcass, I would think that would help to attract bad things to your garden.
I hear you. Well, I love the philosophy of give roses a balanced diet. Now, the one thing I don't think you mentioned is the nails. And I really don't know where that comes from. Is that an iron related
Yeah, it would
thing?
be an iron related thing. And, once again, it's not, some of these things have, they stick around because they make some sense. If you put iron into the soil, then your rose can find iron there. But again, in a good balanced fertilizer, there will be a source of iron in there. And if your rose is sincerely short of iron, you could find it, the chelated iron, it's spelled CHELATED, or chelate, that will be much more bioavailable to your rose. So if you legitimately had a lack of that iron, that would probably be the way to go.
Okay, great. So feeding in the spring, you start off with a cup of alfalfa pellets or meal. You do that maybe every month or so, and you're really focused on feeding the soil. You're suggesting kelp liquid or something like that. Do you do foliars feeding in the summer?
Yeah, certainly. And between those bulk fertilizers, and when you say alfalfa, I use the example of alfalfa. You could certainly use manure or compost or any other bulk organic amendment. And between those, you can buff up with fish emulsion, is a fish fertilizer, which tends to be a little higher in nitrogen than the other ones, but it can be a good boost. That liquid kelp, you can use kelp meal around the base, or you can use liquid kelp. So all of those things can help to quickly buff up the condition of your roses, especially if you see just sort of a lack of vigor, or you start to see a little bit of yellowing, or just, and you can start to read your roses. Generally, I would stick to, the basic fertilizers unless you see a need for it. And then if you think it's going to help you with the recovery from a bloom period, and the rose looks a little bit lackadaisical, a little hit of liquid fertilizer is okay. The downside of that is that people don't know where to draw the line, and more fertilizer is definitely more harmful than under fertilizing. So
good to remember. So it's the less is more philosophy when it comes to the balanced diet. Just like humans, eat a little less, right?
The same thing. You do a calorie restriction on humans, and
exactly.
You're going to live longer, you're going to be healthier. I think your roses, if they have to fight a little bit to get the nutrients, I think it's not the worst thing. And
you're a tough love rose guy.
Well, yeah, I guess. I don't spend a lot of time fussing over their nutrition in the field, that's for sure.
Well, you're highly successful, whatever you're doing. But I heard you say wood ash happens to be a commodity most of us on the islands have a fair bit of. You can probably see my wood stove in the background of my screen back there. Tell me how you use wood ash successfully for roses, because I know it's one of those, if you use too much, you're going to burn the heck out of plants.
Yeah, and that's the whole point, is just sparingly. A tablespoon of wood ash around the base of a plant is plenty, for a nice little boost of potassium. So I talked about that NPK if you have the alfalfa at 212, but you want a little more potassium in there. You throw in some wood ash, it gives you some potassium. It also has a good amount of phosphorus in it. But again, sparingly, because the wood ash will do two things. One, it will add the nutrients, but the second thing is it also boosts the pH. It brings up the alkalinity of the soil, and a quick spike in alkalinity can serve to damage soil life a little bit. So you have a population of bacteria and other microbes and soil life down below the plant. If you shock it in a direction, you're going to replace that population with something new. So you want to do whatever you're doing on that slowly. And that's, again, the point of fertilizing organically. I've got no problem with people who want to fertilize with chemical fertilizers and give your roses a good balanced chemical fertilizer throughout the season. But what it won't do is it won't be feeding that population of microbes and life below the soil. And so that's why I kind of focus in that direction for roses in the ground. If you're talking about roses in a container, which is a whole different topic, then in that case, going the more conventional route with slow release fertilizers might make a little more sense, because it's a little more difficult to manage organic amendments in a container. But in the soil, the best argument is to feed the soil.
Well, you just epitomized why you are my rose guru, Jason Croutch. And that is because you have a holistic approach that is also very practical. So, when you talk about feeding soil microorganisms, you're really talking my language because, we really need to focus on the health of the soil. And then at the same time, you have this lovely perspective of, hey, if you've got a balcony garden, and you've got potted roses, then you're going to have a slightly different approach, but probably still caring about the microorganisms a bit, I imagine.
Well, sure, yeah. But, the problem with those small containers is that getting an organic fertilizer to release the right way, I mean, it has so many fluctuations in temperature and moisture, it can become tricky to manage. Actually, as for managing organic fertilizers in containers, the people I would turn to for expertise are the cannabis people. And I know you don't want to talk too much about them being your gardening information sources, but the thing is they've dealt with these challenges already. A lot of them are pretty hardcore about just using organic source, and a lot of them are growing in containers. So if you want to know how to do it, those are the guys who have blazed the trail, so to speak.
Well, once again, you're talking the language of our islands, Jason. How did you even know that would be so simpatico? Okay, are we ready to move on to the watering aspect of keeping our roses blooming throughout the summer?
Sure. What people will find, and this may speak to people who are looking out in their garden right now and seeing this wonderful flush of blooms, like, wow, the roses are so large, they're so vigorous, they're doing so well this time of year. Why don't they ever look this way in July? And they're right. And part of the biggest reason for that is to do with available soil moisture. So early in the spring, especially here in the Lower Mainland, we're coming out of winter with a big storehouse of moisture in that soil. And then as we hit the warmer weather of June and July, it depletes and it depletes and it depletes. And so your roses can't afford to put that much moisture, put that level of attention into every flower. So what you can do to try to help with that is just irrigation. And irrigation in terms of roses, you might do, instead of doing overhead irrigation, it does make sense to aim at irrigating the base with drip line. And the other thing I'll say is it's really helpful to use a mulch. And whether you're using a bark mulch or organic mulch, or whether you're using something less organic or inorganic, that's fine either way. But the goal is to try to retain some of that moisture at the base of the plant and keep it blooming. Now, what will you see in your roses if they're being underwatered? Well, one of the things you may see is a general yellowing, smallness of flowers, and specifically towards the mid-range of the foliage. The rose itself, the shrub will decide to hold on to its leaves at the very top and outside of the rose, but it may start to give up a lot of the leaves in the inside of the rose. It's just natural that those are the ones that are the least important to the shrub. So you'll see those turning dramatically yellow and starting to drop. And again, the flowers becoming smaller will indicate that your roses are getting less moisture than they'd like to have.
Wow, you are the rose doctor. I did not realize that those were that those symptoms indicated specifically a low moisture level. I don't have an irrigation system. I have a huge garden. I have several huge gardens. They're not all roses, but a lot of food. And I water everything with a hose, so by hand. Because I like to get up close and personal with the plants, but also I just don't have an irrigation system. So if we were talking, gallons, can you tell I'm come from the US? How many gallon buckets or 5-gallon buckets would I use on a big rambling rose in the high heat of summer?
And that very much depends on your rose and how big the rose is and your location. So you do have to free yourself of the measurement a little bit. You could definitely talk in the range of gallons and say, well, you want to give a gallon twice a week or something along those lines. But the larger the rose, you're going to find that isn't sufficient. So you'll be looking for those signs on the rose as well. And as for whether you use an irrigation system or not, I mean, hand watering is fantastic. You're right, it does keep you really in tune with what your plant is telling you and what you're looking for in the plant. And the only advantage I say about going to a drip irrigation or something that goes down low is that and I'm now talking in contrast to overhead irrigation, is that overhead irrigation can be a little bit hard on some plants because it just keeps their foliage wet so much. And with roses, as just a particular host of foliar diseases, having wet foliage all the time can bring on some of those problems.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder. I don't do any overhead watering on the roses, especially. I mean, some of my leafy greens I do. Okay, before we say bye-bye, we're coming up to the time that you gave us. Thank you so much for this, by the way. Do you want to say anything about aphids, black spot, some of the things that are bound to show up around this season? And one question, stink bugs. I'm seeing more stink bugs this year than I've ever seen before. Oh, that's 3 big things. Do you mind responding to that?
Well, I can't speak too much to stink bugs. I haven't seen them too much here. I'm sure their population can move in cycles like many of the other insects. But I can talk a lot about aphids because it is one of those things where I get aphids in my roses for production. I sell roses with aphids on them. And, that's going to sound bad to people. They're going to say, oh, well, why would you do that? It's not that I'm intending to sell roses with aphids on them. I'm not that sensitive about the odd aphid being around my farm. I don't spray for them. I won't spray pesticides here in the farm, both because I don't want to personally, and also because my customers aren't happy to have pesticides on their roses. So if you're not spraying pesticides, you have to accept that the odd aphid is going to fly in. And literally speaking, that's what they do. They are absent from our climates when it's very, very cold. But when it warms up and the tropical breeze flies in, aphids will be falling from the sky and they'll find your garden. They absolutely will. And so this idea of, oh, I bought a plant, it had aphids on it and infested my garden. No, the aphids flew in from the sky. You can't blame anything particular for it. But they will find it. And what aphids do is they have a population boom early in the season, typically, when there aren't a lot of predators around. And so they can build up their populations very, very fast. And there's lots of moisture and lots of fresh new growth in spring. So you will see these wicked aphid infestations in your garden early on. And then suddenly, if you leave it alone, and I'm not saying in all cases this is a valid move, but suddenly you'll walk out there and you'll see that they are all skeletonized and they're all gone and they're wiped out. And that's because the predator populations caught up with them. So in a certain kind of a way, unless you're looking at, boy, it's going to wipe out my whole patch of kale and they're covered in it. In that case, you're going to have to go out there and clean the leaves with a sharp spray of water and a little bit of manual removal. But for the most part, if you wait long enough, the aphids will be dealt with in the population. They're dumb, they're slow moving, and they're juicy bags of plant sap. So the predators will find them and they will take care of them. So
wow. Okay, I'm loving your approach and your description very, very much. Do you have a word about black spot? It seems to be just the nature of roses at certain times of the year. Should we care less
about all plants have their own specific diseases. For roses, black spot is the one. I mean, powdery mildew goes across a wide range of plants, different organisms involved, but black spot tends to be a rose thing. And it also is not something you can exclude from your garden. There's a running theme here is you can't prevent it. You can't really prevent it. Aphids like black spot, they float in the air and the black spot spores will find your roses. What will really make the difference is the conditions you have in your garden and the roses that you have in your garden. And the roses are probably more important. The varieties of roses are probably more important to this than people would initially give it credit for, because some roses are really just black spot magnets. They're very susceptible to it. They can't fight it off. So many of my beloved old bourbon roses are very susceptible to black spot, and they will get it very quickly. But some of the newer shrub roses and some of the David Austin roses have been bred specifically for resistance to that black spot, and so they won't get it quite so severely. Now, in addition to that, they are looking for wet weather. Black spot spores require wet weather and standing foliage, standing water on the foliage for it to germinate and start to infect those leaves. And so overhead irrigation, that's why I mentioned it earlier, can exacerbate the problem. Wet weather, and not that we're any stranger to wet weather here in the Fraser Valley, so we get that too. But the other thing you can do is you can prune your roses. And I mentioned when I was talking about the deadheading step of keeping the center of your rose bush a little bit cleaned up and clear. That's for the purpose of letting that moisture dry off from the inside of the rose. If it sits there and it's holding water all day on the inside of the rose, then that black spot will begin to establish on the inside of the rose and the lower portion of the rose, and then it will move upwards and infest the whole thing. Now, the other thing I want to say about this is not the end of the world. Generally, a black spot infestation on your roses, it may raise to the point of dropping a bunch of leaves and reducing the vigor of your rose, but it isn't going to kill your rose. It's primarily a cosmetic problem. It's something that you just don't want to have to look at. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person if you have a bad bit of black spot in your garden. It's not something that people will, well, there might be a few people who put their nose up in the air, but I don't know them. I don't know those people anymore.
It doesn't sound like you want to know them either.
No. I think those are people from my grandmother's generation.
That's right. Okay, really is my last question, although I could go on and on and on. I hope you'll come back and have another gabbing about gardening session with us. But what are the one or two roses that you carry that you recommend people who are just getting into roses? Because I was intimidated for years. I really was one of those people that was afraid to grow roses. And even though I don't know the names of my roses, they're doing okay without me calling them by name. So I'm over that phobia. And I know other people are where I was not that long ago in terms of feeling intimidated. What are the roses you are recommending that you carry, Jason, for beginners?
Well, I can give you a couple of good recommendations. And, I don't know why these are the ones coming to mind, but in the very bright, warmer colors, orange and yellow, you have Julia Child in a sort of a butter yellow, very well-formed flowers, great scent, almost smells like licorice, and it's just bulletproof. Just performs well every year. Every time I see it in the garden, I'm like, yeah, that's Julia Child, because it's performing extremely well. Another one is an orange one called Fellowship, or you may also see it marketed under the name Livin' Easy. And that one is a bright, bright orange, gorgeous color, and again, bulletproof. It's a little larger than Julia Child. Julia Child in my garden will average around 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet. Fellowship will be more like 5 or 6. Somewhere in between the two of them, in a range of yellow with orange highlights, is another rose that I've taken on called South Africa. And South Africa is a wonderful rose, and it bridges the gap between those two warm colors. In pink, if you're looking for the classic pink rose, you could look for something called Beverly. Beverly is fantastic. And I'm bringing in a bunch of roses this year that I'll be selling next year. This isn't a commercial, but I'm going to say the name Cordes, Kordes, is a German breeder of roses that's put a lot of focus into having disease resistance and easy growing, but still maintaining some of those wonderful characteristics that we liked about the old garden roses, a good scent, a beautiful form, something that would look good in a vase. Unlike, and I'm not slagging anybody, but unlike the knockout roses or those kind of landscapey shrubby roses, which are kind of flimsy in the way that they look. They have wonderful qualities. They don't get diseases. They grow well. They drop their petals cleanly, but it's not something that you would display as a cut flower. I do have an affinity for those older styles of roses.
Great. So you do have some preferences. Well, thank you for all of those. That's Julia Child, Fellowship, Living Easy, Beverly, and South Africa. And how do we reach you and how do we order roses from you, Jason Croutch?
Well, ordering roses, we do it all through the website. So pretty much all of our sales are online now. Even the local sales are all pre-arranged by online purchase. And it's just our way of trying to keep control of our business, particularly in these past couple of years when we've had the restrictions on people visiting the farm or doing retail. We've had to move to online, and I think we're going to stick with it. I think that's so that way everybody can get a fair shot of looking at what we're offering at any given time. It will say on the online store whether it's something that's available just for local pickup or whether it's something that is available for mail order. And those again will be the spring and the fall. And I've taken on kind of an interesting business move of picking up some of my roses and bringing them to people. I'm not talking individual delivery, but for instance, I'm taking a trip out to Bowen Island in a couple of weeks. And the people of the Garden Club of Bowen, I've placed that option of delivery to Bowen on my website for online ordering. And they've done a great job of buying up most of my remaining selection of roses. So
that's great.
Doing road trips like that can hopefully work for my business. And just speaking of your own location, my trip out to Quadra was really exemplary for the same reason. A lot of people from Quadra were great supporters of the business and purchased a lot of roses in advance, and it made my trip out there very worthwhile, as if meeting you fine people wouldn't have been worthwhile anyway.
Well, it was a wonderful occasion and people are still talking about it and thrilled. So that's FraserValleyRoseFarm.com.
Yes.
Okay, lovely. And I encourage everyone to watch Jason's YouTube videos, no matter what the topic is: pruning, feeding, propagating, choosing roses. Jason's YouTube videos are entertaining and informative. I love watching them. I watch them over and over again. Thank you so much for joining us today on Gabbing About Gardening, Jason.
It was very much my pleasure.
I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye now.